For the staff at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, the Gilded Compass, he was more of an event than a customer. Kevin Finch, the tech billionaire who had vanished from public life a decade ago. When his reservation came through, the entire restaurant held its breath. It was a performance, and every single person had a part to play. But on this cold Tuesday night, one person in the cast, a waitress named Leora Rossi, would notice something no one else did. It wasn't the way his $2,000 suit hung on his frame or the cold disinterest in his eyes. It was a tremor, a tiny, almost invisible flutter in his left hand as he reached for his water. A secret the billionaire was trying to hide from the world. A secret that was about to become a matter of life and death. The Gilded Compass was a universe unto itself, a pocket of suspended reality on the Upper East Side, where time was measured in the uncorking of vintage Bordeaux and the soft clinking of Christoffel silverware. For Leora Rossi, it was just a job, a brutally demanding high-stakes job that paid well enough to keep the lights on in her cramped Queen's apartment, and more importantly, to cover the mounting medical bills for her mother's multiple sclerosis. Each night, Leora transformed. She shed the worried daughter, the former pre-med student who'd been forced to drop out, and became a seamless cog in this machine of opulence. She was efficient, observant, and invisible, the three qualities their draconian manager, Mr. Dubois, demanded. Tonight, however, was different. The air was electric with a tension that had nothing to do with the usual Michelin star pressure. Kevin Finch was dining in the private salon. Finch wasn't just wealthy. He was a myth, a programming prodigy who co-founded the revolutionary AI firm Cognito Dynamics. He had retreated from the world after a hostile takeover attempt by his own partner 10 years ago. He won the corporate war, but seemed to have lost the will to be seen, becoming a notorious recluse. He communicated with the world through his chief of security and a handful of trusted lawyers. For him to appear in person was akin to a solar eclipse. Leora was assigned to the periphery of his party, responsible for beverages and assisting the lead waiter. Her station gave her a perfect vantage point. The party consisted of Finch, a man in his late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes clouded by a perpetual weariness, his much younger, immaculately dressed nephew, Nathan Sterling, and two stern-faced Japanese investors. A deal was clearly being forged over the $500 a plate tasting menu. At the edge of the room, standing as still as a statue, was Finch's head of security, a formidable man named Gideon, whose eyes missed nothing. Or so Leora thought. It was when Finch reached for his water glass that she first saw it. A tremor so slight it was almost a vibration in the fingers of his left hand. He seemed to notice it himself immediately, steadying his left hand with his right as he lifted the glass. He took a sip, his face an unreadable mask, and placed it down with deliberate care. The investors were deep in conversation with his nephew, and no one else seemed to register the tiny imperfection. But Leora had spent 2 years in pre-med. She had spent hundreds of hours in clinical settings, her mind trained to spot the subtle tells of a body in distress. She remembered a neurology lecture on essential tremors, Parkinson's, and the early signs of cerebrovascular disease. The observation filed itself away in her brain, a tiny red flag fluttering in the corner of her mind. 15 minutes later, she approached to refill the water glasses. As she leaned in near Mr. Finch, she caught something else. A scent. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the rich aromas of truffle oil and seared scallops. But it was there. A vaguely sweet, fruity odor, almost like nail polish remover. Her mind instantly leaped to a toxicology lecture. Acetone. The scent of ketoacidosis, a severe complication of diabetes. But a man like Finch would have the best medical care in the world. They wouldn't let it get to that stage. She pushed the thought away. It was probably a guest's perfume or a cleaning agent she'd never noticed before. She was overthinking it. She was a waitress, not a doctor. Her job was to be invisible. Yet she couldn't shake the image of the tremor. Later, as the main courses were served, she saw him subtly flex and unflex his left hand under the table. He was fighting it. He was hiding it. The disconnect was jarring, the immense power and control he projected versus the quiet, desperate battle he seemed to be waging with his own body. The invisible tremor was a crack in the billionaire's flawless facade, and Leora felt a growing, terrifying certainty that she was the only one who had seen it. The dinner progressed like a meticulously choreographed ballet. Nathan Sterling Finch's nephew was the star performer. He was charming, articulate, and effortlessly navigated the complex technical and financial jargon with the Japanese investors. He laughed at their jokes, refilled their sake, and directed the conversation with the skill of a seasoned conductor, often speaking for his uncle. Kevin Finch, by contrast, remained a figure of quiet gravity. He would nod, offer a terse, "That's correct," or "The projections are sound," but his contributions were minimal. Anyone watching would assume it was his classic, enigmatic style, the genius letting his protégé handle the minor details. Leora saw something else. She saw a flicker of confusion in Finch's eyes when one of the investors asked a direct, multi-part question about quarterly growth algorithms. For a heartbeat, Finch looked lost. Nathan jumped in smoothly. "What my uncle means to say is that the beta phase results were even stronger than anticipated." And the moment was gone. The cracks were widening. Leora's hands, usually rock steady, as she carried trays laden with expensive crystal, felt clammy. Her mind was a whirlwind. Say something. Don't say something. It's not your place. But what if it's serious? She remembered Dr. Albright, her favorite professor, stressing the importance of observing the total clinical picture. The tremor, the acetone scent, the momentary cognitive lapse. Individually, they could be dismissed. Together they painted a disturbing picture. It looked like a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, a warning shot fired by the brain before the big one. Her chance came when she was clearing the appetizer plates. She moved to Mr. Finch's side. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of conversation. Finch's eyes snapped to hers. They weren't just tired anymore. They were startled and, for a second, vulnerable. He looked like a man whose most carefully guarded secret had just been spoken aloud. His jaw tightened. "I'm perfectly fine," he said, his voice low and cold, a clear dismissal. Gideon, the security chief, took a half-step forward from his post by the wall. His gaze was like a physical weight pressing her down. Rebuffed and unnerved, Leora retreated to the kitchen. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Problem, Rossi?" Mr. Dubois materialized beside her. His thin lips pursed in disapproval. He had a sixth sense for any deviation from his rigid standards. "Mr. Dubois, I'm concerned about Mr. Finch," Leora said, keeping her voice low. "I think he might be unwell." I noticed a tremor in his hand and a moment of confusion. Dubois stared at her as if she'd just suggested serving ketchup with the caviar. "You are concerned. You are a waitress. Your job is to carry plates and pour wine. The day Mr. Finch requires a medical opinion from his waitress is the day I close this restaurant. Do you understand me? Do not under any circumstances interact with that table again unless specifically requested. You are jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar deal and the reputation of this establishment with your fantasies." The condescension in his voice was a slap in the face. Humiliation burned in her cheeks. He was right, wasn't he? Who was she? A college dropout playing doctor. She nodded numbly. "Yes, Mr. Dubois." She went back to her duties, her body on autopilot, but her eyes kept straying to the private salon. As dessert was being served, a delicate raspberry mousse with spun sugar, she saw it happen. Finch reached for his coffee cup, but this time his fingers didn't just tremble, they spasmed. The fine china cup slipped, not falling to the floor, but tipping just enough for hot coffee to slosh onto the pristine white tablecloth. It was a small thing, a minor spill, but it was the final confirmation she needed. Nathan Sterling was instantly there, with a napkin laughing it off. "Uncle, you've got to watch that caffeine intake," he joked, patting Finch's hand. "A bit of a jitter." The investors smiled politely, but Lyora saw Finch's face. It was pale, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead. And as Nathan patted his hand, Lyora saw the nephew's eyes. There was no concern in them. There was something else. A flicker of cold, calculating impatience. It was there for only a second, but it chilled her to the bone. This was no longer a question of propriety or risking her job. Mr. Dubois and his precious restaurant could go to hell. A man's life was on the line. She untied her apron, placed it neatly on a service counter, and walked purposefully towards the private room, straight towards the unmovable wall that was Gideon. Gideon saw her coming. He'd been watching her ever since she'd had the audacity to speak to Mr. Finch. He saw the way her eyes kept darting back to the table, the tension in her posture. He'd pegged her as a potential problem the moment she'd walked on shift, too observant, her gaze lingering a fraction too long. In his line of work, you learned to profile people instantly. He thought she might be a journalist trying to get a quote, or worse, someone planning a process service or a public stunt. As she approached, her face set with grim determination, he moved to intercept, positioning his body to block the entrance to the salon without being overtly aggressive. "That's far enough, miss," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of emotion. It was the voice he used 100 times a year to stop 100 different problems. "I need to speak with you." Lyora said, her voice shaking slightly, but her eyes locked on his. "It's about Mr. Finch. It's urgent." "Mr. Finch is in a private meeting. Whatever it is, it can wait." He began to turn a clear dismissal. "No, it can't. He's having a stroke. Or a TIA. He needs a doctor. Now." The clinical terms gave Gideon a moment's pause. This wasn't the usual plea from a star-struck fan or the rambling of a crank. He gave her a more thorough appraisal. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes, but her simple black uniform was immaculate. Her eyes weren't crazed. They were clear and filled with a desperate intensity. "Mr. Finch's health is monitored by the best physicians in the country," Gideon stated flatly. "He is fine." "He's not. He has a unilateral tremor in his left hand. He's trying to suppress. I saw at least one instance of transient aphasia when he failed to respond to a direct question, and there's evidence of motor skill degradation. He just spilled his coffee. These are textbook signs of a cerebrovascular event in progress." The string of medical jargon was delivered with a confidence that again stopped Gideon cold. She wasn't just throwing words around. She knew what they meant. "How would you know any of that?" he asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to suspicious. "Who are you?" "My name is Lyora Rossi. I was a pre-med student at Columbia for 2 years, specializing in neurology before I had to." "Stop. I know what I'm seeing. He's in danger." From the dining room, Mr. Dubois was watching the confrontation, his face turning a shade of purple. He started marching towards them. This was Leora's last chance. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice, forcing Gideon to lean in slightly. "I smelled acetone on his breath. It could indicate non-ketotic hyperglycemia, which can present with stroke-like symptoms. If they treat him for a stroke, but it's actually a metabolic crisis, the treatment could kill him." That was it. That was the detail that broke through Gideon's professional armor. A tremor could be stress. Confusion could be fatigue. But a specific scent linked to a specific life-threatening condition. That was too detailed to be a lie. It was expert knowledge. He had been with Finch for 15 years. He knew the man had a complex medical history, managed by a team of private doctors. But what if they'd missed something? What if this acute event was happening right now under his watch? His primary directive was to protect Kevin Finch's life. All other concerns were secondary. Mr. Dubois arrived sputtering with rage. "Gideon, my apologies. I will remove this hysterical employee at once." "She is fired, of course. The disrespect, the absolute—" Gideon held up a hand, silencing the manager without even looking at him. His eyes were still locked on Leora's. He saw no hysteria. He saw terrifying certainty. He had a choice: believe the fuming manager worried about his restaurant's reputation, or believe the pre-med waitress with the look of a Cassandra in her eyes, foretelling a disaster no one else could see. He made his decision. "What do you suggest?" Gideon asked her, his voice still low. Leora's shoulders sagged with relief. "You need to get him out of there without causing a scene. Get him to a hospital. Tell them to check his blood glucose and run a toxicology screen. Don't let them just assume it's a standard stroke." Before Gideon could respond, a sudden commotion erupted from within the salon. A chair scraped violently against the floor. Nathan Sterling's voice, sharp with alarm, yelled, "Uncle Kevin!" Gideon pushed past Leora, barging into the room. The two Japanese investors were on their feet, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. Nathan was bent over his uncle's chair. Kevin Finch was slumped to one side, his eyes open but unseeing. The left side of his face was drooping, and a thin line of saliva trickled from the corner of his slack mouth. He was completely unresponsive. The unbreakable wall had been right to listen. But he might already be too late. The curated tranquility of the gilded compass shattered into a million pieces. The hushed whispers were replaced by a sharp gasp from one of the investors, the clatter of a dropped fork, and Nathan Sterling's frantic, "Somebody call 911!" Gideon was already on it, his phone to his ear, his voice a calm, authoritative beacon in the rising sea of panic. "This is Gideon Hayes. I have a medical emergency at the Gilded Compass. Potential stroke. Male late 50s. Yes, it's a VIP. Get me a priority ambulance. We're heading to Lenox Hill." Mr. Dubois looked ashen, his managerial control completely gone, wringing his hands as he saw his restaurant's pristine reputation being sullied by the ugly reality of a medical emergency. Leora, who had followed Gideon into the room, instinctively moved towards Finch. Her pre-med training kicked in a muscle memory of emergency room rotations. "Get him on the floor flat. We need to protect his airway," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Nathan looked up at her, his face a mask of panicked concern. "Who the hell are you?" "She's with me," Gideon said, ending the conversation. He and one of the other security men gently eased Finch's limp body from the chair onto the plush carpet. Leora knelt beside him, tilting his head back slightly to ensure his airway was clear, checking his pulse. It was there, thready, but present. The few minutes it took for the paramedics to arrive felt like an eternity. Leora stayed by Finch's side, a silent guardian. She saw how his left arm and leg were completely flaccid. The facial droop was pronounced. It was a classic massive stroke presentation. Yet that faint, fruity scent still lingered in the air around him, a ghost at the feast, a detail that didn't fit. The paramedics were a whirlwind of professional efficiency, their questions sharp and direct. When did the symptoms start? Any known medical conditions? Is he on any medication? Nathan answered, stepping into the role of concerned next of kin. It just happened. 1 minute he was fine, the next, this. He's on some blood pressure medication, I think. Nothing major. He's very healthy. Leora wanted to scream. Tell them about the tremor. Tell them it started an hour ago. Tell them about the scent. But she was a nobody, a fired waitress. Her voice would be lost in the chaos. As they loaded Finch onto the gurney, Gideon turned to her. I need your full name and phone number, he said, his face grim. I might have questions. She gave it to him, her own name and number, feeling foreign on her tongue. Her entire world had been upended in the span of an hour. She had lost her job. She had stared down a man who could crush her with a word. And she had watched a billionaire collapse. She stood by the now empty table, a ghost in her own former workplace. The spilled coffee stain on the tablecloth looked like a dark, ugly omen. Mr. Dubois approached her, his face a thundercloud. Get your things and get out, he hissed. You are not to speak of this to anyone. You'll receive your final paycheck in the mail. There was no fight left in her. She walked back to the staff locker room, the adrenaline leaving her system replaced by a deep, bone-aching weariness. She had done the right thing, and her reward was unemployment. She thought of her mum, of the next round of bills, and a wave of despair washed over her. An hour later, sitting in her small apartment, the silence was deafening. She couldn't rest. She turned on her laptop and started searching her fingers, flying across the keyboard. Stroke symptoms mimicking metabolic acidosis. Chemicals inducing unilateral paralysis. Acetone sent on breath without diabetes. She fell down a rabbit hole of medical journals and toxicology reports. Most of it was obscure academic. But then she found it. A case study from a German medical journal published 8 years ago. It described a new designer chemical, a synthetic toxin developed as a research compound. It was an insulin mimetic, meaning it caused a person's blood sugar to plummet catastrophically. The side effects were listed in chilling detail: confusion, slurred speech, tremors, seizures, and finally hemiplegia paralysis on one side of the body. It perfectly mimicked a massive ischemic stroke. And one of the metabolic byproducts of the compound, breaking down in the body, acetone, a cold dread far worse than the fear she'd felt in the restaurant, crept up her spine. A stroke was a tragedy of biology. This would be something else entirely. This would be murder. Her phone rang, the sudden noise making her jump. It was an unknown number. Hello. Leora Rossi. The voice was Gideon's. It was flat, exhausted. We're at Lenox Hill. The doctors are confirming a massive ischemic stroke. They've administered a thrombolytic, a clot-busting drug. Leora's blood ran cold. No, she whispered. What? Gideon, she said, her voice urgent. The clot-buster. If his blood sugar is dangerously low, if his blood isn't clotting properly because of something else, that drug could cause a cerebral hemorrhage. A catastrophic bleed in his brain. You have to stop them. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The doctors know what they're doing," Gideon said, but for the first time there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Ask them about the scent," Leora pleaded, her voice cracking. "Ask them if they checked his blood glucose levels before administering the TPA. Ask them if they considered a toxicological cause. Please, Gideon. They're treating the symptom, not the cause. You have to make them listen." She heard muffled voices in the background, a doctor speaking in calming, professional tones. Gideon was clearly in the middle of a consultation. He came back on the line. "They said his blood sugar was a little low, but nothing critical. They're confident in their diagnosis." Leora's heart sank. She imagined a team of brilliant, overworked ER doctors seeing a textbook stroke and applying the textbook treatment. They wouldn't be looking for the zebra when they heard hoofbeats. But she had seen the zebra. She had smelled it. And she was terrified that the very medicine meant to save Kevin Finch was about to become the weapon that killed him. The next 24 hours were a torment of silence. Leora was adrift. She was unemployed, her actions at the restaurant likely blacklisting her from every fine dining establishment in the city. She called her mother, forcing a cheerful tone. She didn't feel assuring her everything was fine. After the call, she sat in the dark, her laptop open to the German case study, the words blurring in front of her eyes. She felt powerless, a Cassandra whose prophecy had been heard but not believed. The call came just after 3 a.m. It was Gideon again. "He's not responding to the treatment," he said, his voice raw with exhaustion and something else fear. "In fact, he's worse. He had a small seizure an hour ago. The doctors are confused. His intracranial pressure is rising, but not in a way that's consistent with the initial stroke. They're talking about a brain bleed." Leora closed her eyes, a wave of nausea washing over her. "The TPA," she whispered. "It caused the bleed." "How can you be so sure?" Gideon's voice was sharp, not with accusation, but with a desperate need to understand. "Because it wasn't a clot, Gideon. I think he was poisoned. The substance I read about, it doesn't just mimic a stroke. It's a potent anticoagulant. Giving him a clot buster would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. It would cause spontaneous hemorrhaging." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of hospital machinery beeping. "I'm at the hospital cafeteria," Gideon said finally. "The one on the ground floor. Can you get here?" 30 minutes later, Leora was sitting opposite the imposing security chief in a sterile, brightly lit cafeteria that smelled of bleach and old coffee. Gideon looked like he'd aged a decade. His suit was rumpled, his tie was loosened, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Tell me everything," he said. Leora pulled out her phone and showed him the article she'd found. She explained the mechanism of the toxin, how it would cause hypoglycemia and paralysis, how the acetone scent was the key. She recounted every detail she had observed at the dinner. The subtle tremor, the moment of confusion, the nephew's smooth interruption, the final collapse. As she spoke, she laid out the pieces of a puzzle that Gideon had been staring at without being able to assemble. He thought back over the past few months. Kevin had been more tired than usual. He'd complained of occasional dizzy spells, which his private physician had dismissed as stress and overwork. He'd become more and more reliant on his nephew Nathan to handle the day-to-day operations of the company. Nathan. Gideon said the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. He administers his uncle's insulin. Finch is a borderline type 2 diabetic, controls it mostly with diet, but needs a small dose of long-acting insulin every evening. Leora's eyes widened. That's the delivery mechanism. It wouldn't be in his food or drink, which you probably screen. It would be in the one place, No one would ever look his medicine. The horror of it settled over them. Nathan Sterling, the charming, devoted nephew, the heir apparent. He wasn't waiting for his inheritance. He was accelerating it, orchestrating a perfect, untraceable murder that looked like a natural death. A stroke was tragic, but common for a man of Finch's age and stress level. No one would question it. "The doctors won't listen to me," Gideon said, rubbing his face. "I'm just the security guy, and they certainly won't listen to a waitress. We have a theory, a terrifying one, but we have no proof." "Then we have to get it," Leora said, a new fire igniting in her. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "We need to find a sample of the insulin he's been using. We need to test it." Nathan is by his side constantly. He's playing the part of the grieving relative perfectly. He has control over who sees him, what comes into the room. The hospital staff see him as the primary family contact. "What about his home, his office?" Leora pressed. Gideon shook his head. Nathan had the penthouse sealed. Said it was on his uncle's orders for privacy. He's thought of everything. They were at a dead end. Nathan held all the cards. They were outside the castle walls, while the king lay dying inside. "Wait." Leora said, her mind racing. "The restaurant. When the paramedics came, everything was chaos. People were running around. Staff were clearing the table. But what if something was left behind?" Gideon looked at her, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. "What are you thinking? Mr. Finch has a habit, right?" "An eccentric one," Leora asked, remembering a piece of staff gossip. "He doesn't use regular pens. He uses a vintage fountain pen." Gideon nodded slowly. "A Mont Blanc Meisterstück. His father gave it to him. He never goes anywhere without it." He was trying to make a note on a napkin just before he collapsed, Leora remembered. He dropped the pen. In all the chaos. Did anyone pick it up? Gideon's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, his face hardening. "It's the hospital. They want Nathan's permission to perform an emergency craniotomy to relieve the pressure on his brain. His chances are less than 50%. Time was running out. "I'm going back to the restaurant," Leora said, standing up. "Mr. Dubois hates me, but the cleaning staff, they know me. Maybe, just maybe, it's still there." "It's a long shot," Gideon said, his voice grim. "It's the only shot we have," Leora replied, already moving towards the exit. Her mind focused on one thing, a small black and gold fountain pen that might hold the key to everything. Returning to the gilded compass felt like visiting a graveyard. It was nearly 5 a.m., and the only person there was a night janitor mopping the gleaming marble floors. The restaurant was silent, the ghosts of last night's diners and drama hanging heavy in the air. Leora's keycard had already been deactivated. She had to knock on the glass service door, praying someone would answer. The janitor, a kind elderly man named Hector, whom she'd always shared a friendly word with, peered out. He recognized her, and after a moment's hesitation, let her in. "Leora, Mr. Dubois, said you were fired. I know, Hector. I think I left something very important in the staff locker room." She lied, her heart pounding. "Can I just check quickly? I'll be out in 2 minutes." Hector, who had no love for Mr. Dubois, nodded and let her pass. "Don't let him see you." She didn't go to the locker room. She went straight to the private salon. It had been cleaned, the tables reset for the next day's service. The tablecloth with the coffee stain was gone. Her stomach clenched in disappointment. Of course, they would have cleaned everything meticulously. She got down on her hands and knees, her eyes scanning the floor beneath the table where Finch had sat, her fingers probing the thick pile of the Persian rug. Nothing. She checked under the curtains behind the legs of the heavy mahogany sideboard. It was hopeless. Dejected, she was about to leave when she noticed the trash receptacle by the service station just outside the salon. It was a discreet, elegant wooden bin, and it was full. The night cleaners must have emptied the room's smaller bins into this one for Hector to take out in the morning. Her hands trembling with a mixture of hope and disgust, she began carefully sifting through the contents: discarded linen napkins, used sugar packets, a broken wine cork. And then her fingers brushed against something hard and cylindrical. She pulled it out. The Mont Blanc Meisterstück, black precious resin with gold-plated details. It was unmistakable. In the chaos of clearing the table, a busboy must have simply swept everything. Napkins, crumbs, and a $10,000 pen into the trash. Clutching it like a holy relic, she thanked a bewildered Hector and rushed out into the pre-dawn chill of the city. She called Gideon. "I have it," she said, her voice breathless. "Where are you? I'm on Lexington. I have the pen." "Don't move," he commanded. "There's a 24-hour lab in Midtown, a private one. Cognitodynamics keeps on retainer for proprietary analysis. I'm sending a car for you. I'll meet you there. I have to stay here. The doctors are about to—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The lab was a sterile, anonymous facility, tucked away in a nondescript office building. A grim-faced technician, clearly woken up by Gideon's call, was waiting for her. He took the pen with a pair of sterile tongs. "What are we looking for?" he asked. "A toxin," Lyora said. "Something that mimics insulin, and we need to know if there are any fingerprints on it besides Mr. Finch's." "This will take a few hours," the tech said, disappearing into the back. The wait was agonizing. Lyora paced the small waiting room, the minutes stretching into an eternity. At 7:15 a.m., Gideon called. His voice was hollow. "They did the surgery. They relieved the pressure, but the bleed was extensive. He's in a coma. The doctors are saying— They're saying we need to prepare ourselves." Lyora felt the floor drop out from under her. They were too late. Even if they found the proof, Kevin Finch was going to die. "Gideon," she said, choking back tears. "Nathan can't get away with this. He just can't." "He won't." Gideon's voice was dangerously quiet. "If what you say is true, I'll handle it myself." Before Lyora could process the chilling implication of his words, the lab technician emerged. His face was pale. "You need to see this," he said. He led her to a monitor, displaying the results of a gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis. A series of complex graphs and chemical structures filled the screen. "The residue on the pen's nib is fascinating. It's not ink," the tech said, pointing to a specific peak on the graph. "It's a highly complex synthetic peptide. I've never seen anything like it. It's designed to bind to insulin receptors and trigger massive glucose uptake. Whoever made this is brilliant and terrifying." "It's the poison," Lyora whispered. "That's not all," the technician said, switching the screen to a fingerprint analysis report. "We lifted 2 clear sets of prints from the barrel of the pen. One belongs to Kevin Finch, as expected. The other—" He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "The other is a perfect match for Nathan Sterling." Lyora stared at the screen at the black and white proof. Nathan hadn't just administered the poison with the insulin. He had been handling the pen, perhaps taking it from his uncle or handing it back to him, leaving his own incriminating mark on the very object that would be his undoing. It was a tiny, arrogant mistake. He had orchestrated the perfect crime, but had overlooked the smallest detail. At that exact moment, Gideon sent her a text message. It was a single, chilling sentence. "The doctor's just left. Nathan is alone with him now." A new terror seized Leora. Nathan wouldn't just let his uncle die. He couldn't risk him waking up even for a moment. He was in that room to finish the job. "I have to go," Leora said to the tech, snapping a picture of the screen with her phone. "Send this report to Gideon Hayes' secure email right now. Tell him the prints are a match." She ran from the lab, hailing a taxi with a wild look in her eyes. "Lenox Hill Hospital," she yelled at the driver. "Drive like someone's life depends on it." Because it did. The sterile, antiseptic air of the laboratory suddenly felt heavy, difficult to breathe. The technician, a man named Dr. Aris Thorne, who had the weary eyes of someone who spent more time with mass spectrometers than people pointed a trembling finger at the monitor. The screen was a cascade of complex data, but his finger rested on a single jagged peak on the graph. "The residue from the pen's nib. It's not ink." Dr. Thorne repeated his voice, a mixture of professional awe and profound disturbance. "It's a synthetic peptide, a bespoke toxin. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen a molecule so elegantly and maliciously designed. It's a key made for a single lock. It binds to insulin receptors and triggers a catastrophic system-wide glucose uptake. It starves the brain of sugar, inducing a state that perfectly mimics the symptoms of a massive ischemic stroke." The acetone scent you noticed. That was the calling card, the metabolic exhaust from this poison's destructive work. Whoever synthesized this is a certifiable genius and a monster. Leora stared at the screen at the scientific confirmation of the evil she had sensed. It was one thing to have a theory, a desperate guess born from a half-forgotten lecture. It was another to see the poison's very soul laid bare in the cold, hard language of chemistry. This was proof. Tangible, irrefutable proof. "But that's not the part that will damn him," Dr. Thorne said, clicking his mouse. The screen changed, displaying a new report, this one from the Fingerprint Analysis Division. 2 sets of prints were illuminated, rendered in stark digital black and white. "We lifted 2 clear, uncompromised sets from the pen's barrel. One set, as you'd expect, belongs to Kevin Finch. We have his prints on file from his corporate security clearance." He paused, letting the silence in the room build. "The other set. Well, it's a perfect match for Nathan Sterling. We matched it against the print he provided for his own executive-level clearance at Cognitodynamics." Leora felt a dizzying wave of both triumph and terror. There it was, the final damning link in the chain. Nathan hadn't just conceived of the murder weapon. He had held it. In a moment of supreme arrogance, perhaps while gesturing during conversation or retrieving the pen for his uncle, he had left his own signature on the instrument of his crime. He had planned the perfect murder, but had neglected the most basic rule of the guilty: you always leave something of yourself behind. At that exact moment, a vibration from her pocket jolted her back to reality. She pulled out her phone. It was a text message from Gideon, a single line of text that made the blood in her veins run cold. "The doctor's just left. Nathan is alone with him now." The air rushed from her lungs. The victory of the lab report evaporated, replaced by a primal, sickening dread. Nathan wasn't just waiting. He knew the doctors were baffled, that his uncle was lingering in a state between life and death. He couldn't risk a recovery, a miraculous awakening, a single slurred word that could expose him. He was not the type to leave things to chance. He was in that room to finish the job, to erase the final piece of evidence, his living, breathing victim. "I have to go," Leora said, her voice tight and hoarse. She snapped a picture of the report on the screen with her phone, a blurry but legible image of Nathan Sterling's guilt. Email everything you have to Gideon Hayes's secure account. Title the subject line, Evidence Urgent. Tell him the prints are a definitive match. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and ran. She burst from the anonymous office building into the grey pre-dawn light of the city. The streets were just beginning to stir, but for Leora, the world was moving in slow motion. She sprinted into the middle of the street, waving her arms wildly at a yellow cab that was cruising down the avenue. The taxi screeched to a halt, the driver laying on the horn. She wrenched the door open and threw herself inside. "Lenox Hill Hospital now," she yelled, her voice ragged. "And I don't care how you get there. Run every red light if you have to." The driver, a grizzled man who had seen everything, took one look at the sheer panic in her eyes and simply nodded, hitting the accelerator. The city became a blur of streaking lights and indistinct shapes. Every second that passed was a hammer blow against her chest. She imagined Nathan in that quiet, sterile room, a pillow pressed down on a helpless face, a silent adjustment to a morphine drip, an air bubble injected into an IV line. The methods were countless, all of them quiet, all of them final. She clutched her phone, the picture of the lab report glowing on the screen. It felt like the heaviest thing in the world. It was the truth, but the truth was useless if it arrived too late. The taxi careened around a corner, and she was thrown against the door. She saw the faces of people on the sidewalk, heading to early shifts, grabbing coffee, all blissfully unaware of the life-or-death race she was in. She was in a different reality, a frantic, desperate world contained within the four doors of this cab. Finally, the hospital loomed ahead. She threw a handful of bills into the front seat before the car had even come to a complete stop, yelling, "Keep the change!" and launched herself out of the cab. She ran through the automatic doors of the emergency entrance, her frantic pace a stark contrast to the hospital's controlled hum. She didn't slow down, ignoring the calls of the reception staff, her eyes scanning for the signs to the ICU. She found the elevator jabbing the button repeatedly, as if that could make it come faster. When the doors opened on the 7th floor, the atmosphere shifted. Here, everything was hushed. The air was thick with tension and the scent of antiseptic. It was a place of quiet, desperate battles. She saw the room number down the hall, 712. And standing before it, as still and imposing as a gargoyle, was Gideon. Outside the room, a hospital security guard stood looking uneasy. As she approached, Gideon saw her, and a flicker of something desperation, hope, crossed his face. "Did you get it?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She couldn't speak, just shoved her phone into his hand. He stared at the picture of the report, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the phone. He looked up, his eyes, which had been filled with doubt and fear, now hardened into 2 chips of granite. He had his proof. "The police are en route," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "ETA is 7 minutes. He looked at the closed door of room 712. 7 minutes is an eternity in there. He just dismissed the private nurse. Sent her on a coffee run. Said he wanted to sit with his uncle to pray. The last word was filled with contempt. The hospital guard stepped forward. "Sir, I'm sorry, but no one else can go in. Family only." Mr. Sterling was very clear. Gideon looked from the guard to Leora, then back to the door. She could see the war raging within him. 15 years of his life had been dedicated to protocol, to operating within the lines, to protecting Kevin Finch with precision and discipline. Now all his training, all his instincts were screaming at him to break every rule in the book. "He's right," Lyora whispered, her mind racing. "We can't just budge in. What if we're wrong? He'll sue us, the hospital." "We're not wrong," Gideon said, the decision made. He looked at the guard. "Son, this is now a cognito-dynamics security operation. You will stand aside, or you will be named as an accomplice in obstructing a life-saving intervention. That's a choice you have to make in the next 3 seconds." The young guard's face went pale. He hesitated, then gave a curt, terrified nod and stepped away from the door. Gideon looked at Lyora. "When I open this door, your job is to be a witness. Stay behind me. Do not interfere unless I am down. Understand?" Lyora nodded, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Gideon placed his hand on the door handle, took a deep, silent breath, and pushed it open. The scene inside was one of surreal, nightmarish tranquility. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic beeps of the monitors, tracking the fragile thread of Kevin Finch's life. He lay utterly still in the center of the bed, a pale figure lost in a tangle of wires and tubes. Standing over him with his back to the door was Nathan Sterling. He wasn't holding a pillow or tampering with the machines. In his hand was a syringe filled with a clear liquid, its needle aimed directly at the injection port of his uncle's central IV line. He was so focused on his task, he hadn't heard them enter over the hum of the equipment. "Drop it, Nathan!" Gideon's voice was not a shout, but a low, commanding roar that seemed to shake the very air in the room. Nathan Sterling's body went ramrod straight. He spun around, and for a fleeting second, his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. But it was immediately replaced by a sneer of reptilian fury. The charming, concerned nephew was gone forever, replaced by the predator that had been lurking underneath. "Gideon!" he hissed, his eyes darting from the security chief to Lyora, who stood half-hidden in the doorway. "The loyal dog and his little stray. You should have learned your place." He didn't lower the syringe. "It's over," Gideon said, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room, positioning himself between Nathan and the bed. "The lab analyzed the pen. They found the toxin, and they found your fingerprints, Nathan, all over it." A strange, broken laugh escaped Nathan's lips. "The pen. My God, the old man and his stupid pen. He was a fossil, Gideon, a legend in his own mind, holding the company back with his archaic ideas of ethics and long-term growth. I am the future." I pushed Cognito into the quantum computing space he was too afraid to touch. It should have been mine long ago. "So you decided to murder him for it," Lyora said, her voice shaking but finding its strength. "To poison him, slowly, making it look like a stroke. It was elegant. It was perfect." Nathan spat, his eyes wild with narcissistic rage. "But he just wouldn't die. He just kept holding on. But it doesn't matter. Without a body, your little lab report is just an interesting theory." He took a menacing step toward the bed, raising the syringe again. "This is just potassium chloride. A massive dose. It will stop his heart. The monitors will show a simple cardiac arrest. Utterly believable for a stroke victim in his condition. By the time you get an autopsy, it will be untraceable." He lunged for the IV port, but Gideon was already moving. He crossed the room in an explosion of controlled violence, grabbing Nathan's wrist an inch from its target. There was a sickening crack as Gideon twisted, forcing Nathan's hand back. The syringe flew from his grasp, shattering against the far wall. Nathan screamed a sound of fury and pain, and swung his other fist wildly, catching Gideon on the side of the head. The two men crashed against the main monitoring console, which erupted in a series of shrill, panicked alarms. It was a brutal, close-quarters struggle. Nathan was younger and fueled by a cornered animal's desperation, but Gideon was a professional, his movements economical and disabling. He drove his shoulder into Nathan's sternum, forcing him back against the wall. He swept Nathan's legs out from under him, and they both went down in a heap. Gideon ended on top, pinning Nathan's arms as he thrashed and cursed vilely. Just as Gideon secured him, the door burst open, and two uniformed NYPD officers charged in. Guns drawn, their shouts of "Police, don't move!" filling the room. It was finally, truly over. As the officers cuffed a spitting, defeated Nathan Sterling and read him his rights, the chaos subsided. Leora stood trembling her back against the doorframe. Her eyes went to the bed. In the midst of the struggle, Kevin Finch had not moved. His life still hung by that same slender thread, measured out by the steady, rhythmic beeps of the machines that had been so violently jostled. Gideon rose to his feet, breathing heavily. He had a cut on his cheek, but his eyes were clear. He walked over and silenced the blaring alarms, restoring the room's quiet sanctity. He stood beside Leora, and together they looked at the man they had just pulled back from the brink. "The lab report," Gideon said quietly to one of the officers. "It's on its way. It will give the doctors what they need. A roadmap." He turned to Leora, his gaze filled with a profound, weary respect. They know what they're fighting now. They're not just treating a stroke, they're fighting a poison. You gave him a chance. Leora walked slowly to the bedside, past the shattered syringe and the remnants of the fight. She looked down at Kevin Finch's face, peaceful in its unconscious state. She reached out her fingers, hesitating for a moment, before she gently rested her hand on his. The hand that had trembled. It was still now, but it was warm. It was alive. "I hope so," she whispered to the quiet hum of the ICU, a prayer for the billionaire and for the new future that had just against all odds been born. The story of Leora Rossi and Kevin Finch is a powerful reminder that heroes are not defined by their uniforms or their job titles. They are defined by their courage, their integrity, and their willingness to act when something is wrong. Leora wasn't a doctor or a detective. She was a waitress with a mountain of her own problems. But her knowledge, her sharp eyes, and her refusal to be silenced saved a man's life and exposed a terrible evil. It makes you wonder how many small, seemingly insignificant details do we miss every day. A co-worker who seems unusually withdrawn, a neighbor who hasn't picked up their mail, a tremor in a stranger's hand. Sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is to pay attention. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things. What did you think of Leora's courage? Let us know in the comments below. What does a billionaire on the verge of signing a $100 million deal have in common with the waitress pouring his water? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. At least that's what Harrison Sterling thought. He was sitting in Aurelia, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, about to change the world of green energy. The contracts were open, the pen was in his hand. But he never saw her coming. He never imagined that a quiet waitress with tired eyes and a tragic past held the one secret that could either save his entire legacy or shatter it into a million hesitations. He was about to sign. Then she leaned in, and with a whisper that cut through the silence, she said 4 words that stopped his world cold. "That's the wrong formula." The air in Aurelia was thick with the scent of money. Not the crisp, vulgar smell of new bills, but the ancient, ingrained aroma of generational wealth, a subtle perfume of truffle oil, vintage leather, and effortless power. Isabella Rossi breathed it in every night. For 8 hours, she'd glide between tables, draped in starched white linen, a ghost in a black uniform, her own identity dissolving into the polished mahogany and crystal glassware. Tonight, Table 12 was the center of the restaurant's universe. It was an unofficial throne nestled in a secluded alcove with a panoramic view of the glittering Manhattan skyline. And seated at its head was the King Harrison Sterling. Bella knew the name, of course. Everyone did. Sterling, the boy genius from MIT, who founded Sterling Dynamics and was now, at 38, a titan of the tech industry. His face, usually seen on the cover of Forbes or Wired, was even more intense in person. Sharp jaw eyes the color of a stormy sea, and an aura of restless energy that seemed barely contained by his bespoke Tom Ford suit. He wasn't just in the room, he owned the space it occupied. With him were 2 men in similarly expensive suits, investors Bella guessed by their cautious expressions and deferential posture. These were Mr. Davenport, a silver-haired patriarch of an old banking family, and Kenji Tanaka from a Tokyo-based venture capital fund. But Bella's attention was drawn to the 4th man, Dr. Robert Kendrick Sterling's head of R&D. He was preening his chest, puffed out, basking in the glow of his boss's success. Bella had served them their appetizers, a delicate seared scallop dish, and was now refilling their water glasses, her movements practiced and invisible. It was a skill she had perfected to be present, but unseen to hear everything and register nothing. The efficiency is unprecedented. Harrison Kendrick was saying, his voice a little too loud. The Sterling-Kendrick catalyst and I do appreciate the joint credit. Truly will reduce the energy cost of electrolysis by 60%. This isn't incremental. This is a paradigm shift. Green hydrogen becomes cheaper than natural gas. Harrison Sterling nodded a curt, impatient gesture. He tapped a sleek black tablet on the table. Show them the core equation, Robert. The part that matters. Kendrick, beaming, picked up a pen and smoothly uncapped it. He grabbed a thick linen napkin, a minor sacrilege in a place like Aurelia, and began to write. Bella's heart gave a strange, painful lurch. It was an echo from a life she had buried 6 years ago. A life of whiteboards, quantum mechanics, and the thrilling pursuit of discovery. A life before the betrayal, before the debt, before this black uniform became her skin. She tried to look away, to focus on the condensation of the water pitcher in her hand. It's not your world anymore, Bella. But she couldn't. Her eyes were drawn to the elegant, flowing script on the napkin. Kendrick was explaining his work with condescending simplicity. It boils down to maximizing the probability of quantum tunneling for the proton transfer. We manipulate the electron spin state of the platinum-iridium lattice. The equation governing the catalytic efficiency, I, is what secures our patent. He finished with a flourish, sliding the napkin to the center of the table. Mr. Davenport and Mr. Tanaka stared at the equation with the polite, uncomprehending reverence of men who dealt in dollars, not Daltons. Sterling, however, studied it with fierce intensity. And the quantum tunneling probability? Function psi. It's stable across all temperatures and pressures we've modeled, ironclad Kendrick said with a smug smile. That's the secret sauce. My own proprietary work. Bella froze. Her hand holding the heavy pitcher trembled almost imperceptibly. Her gaze was fixed on the last term of the equation, puisque s. She could see the full notation in her mind, the complex integral she had spent 2 years of her PhD program deriving. The world around her fell away. The clinking of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, the city lights outside the window. It all vanished. She was back in a dusty university lab smelling of ozone and old coffee. She was standing in front of a whiteboard, her hand covered in marker dust, arguing passionately with her advisor, Professor Albright. She remembered the exhilarating moment of breakthrough, the elegant simplicity of the final proof, her secret source. And it was wrong. Not just slightly off. Catastrophically wrong. She had discovered the error herself a week before she was set to defend her thesis. A subtle yet fatal miscalculation in the electron density variable so-called. When corrected, it didn't just reduce the efficiency. Under high-pressure conditions, the whole reaction became unstable. It created a volatile, explosive byproduct. She had told Albright. He had dismissed her concerns, called it pre-defense jitters. 2 weeks later, he published her original flawed research under his own name, and Kendrick's his former postdoc student. Her name was nowhere. The academic board sided with the tenured professor. Broken and buried in legal threats, she couldn't afford to fight. She dropped out, disappearing into the anonymity of the service industry. Now, 6 years later, her ghost had come back to haunt her on a rich man's napkin, and they were about to build a $100 million time bomb on top of it. Bella's breath caught in her throat. The investors were nodding. Harrison Sterling was reaching for the portfolio of contracts Mr. Davenport had slid across the table. A Mont Blanc pen appeared in his hand. The deal was seconds from being done. She could say nothing. She could let it happen. It wasn't her problem. She was just a waitress, fired for disrupting a high-profile dinner, blacklisted. Who would believe her? But she saw the headline in her mind. Sterling Dynamics plant explosion kills dozens. She saw the smug look on Kendrick's face, a man getting rich and famous off a lie that would get people killed. The old fire, the one she thought had been extinguished by years of grief and exhaustion, roared to life in her chest. Harrison Sterling uncapped the pen. The soft click echoed in the sudden silence of Bella's world. She moved before she could second-guess herself. Her feet carried her forward, silent on the plush carpet. She leaned over Sterling's shoulder, her professional waitress smile a mask of stone, as if to ask if he needed more bread. Her voice was a ghost of a whisper, meant for him alone, a tiny pinprick in the monumental silence of the deal. "Mr. Sterling," she breathed, her lips just inches from his ear. "Don't sign. That's the wrong formula." The world didn't stop, but for Harrison Sterling, it felt like it did. His universe was one of data control and calculated risks. It operated on a set of rigid, predictable principles. A waitress, an anonymous cog in the service machine of a restaurant he'd probably never visit again, did not whisper cryptographic warnings about quantum chemistry in his ear. It was a variable he couldn't compute. His hand holding the pen froze millimeters above the signature line. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to process the words, dismissing them as an auditory hallucination. He half-turned his stormy eyes, locking onto Bella's. He saw a young woman, maybe late 20s, with dark, intelligent eyes that held a depth of seriousness utterly at odds with her role. There was no hint of a prank, no trace of madness. There was only a calm, terrifying certainty. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, a dangerous rumble beneath the surface of the conversation. The other 3 men at the table looked up their polite smiles, faltering. The spell was broken. Mr. Davenport lowered his glasses. "Is there a problem?" Harrison Bella didn't flinch under Sterling's intense scrutiny. She stood perfectly still, her professional poise unwavering, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice still quiet, but clear and steady. "I misspoke." She began to retreat, the survival instinct screaming at her to flee. But Sterling wasn't letting go. He hadn't become a billionaire by ignoring anomalies. "No," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You didn't misspeak." "Say it again." Dr. Kendrick scoffed, a bubble of indignant laughter escaping his lips. "Harrison, what is this?" "The staff is interrupting." He shot Bella a look of pure venom, a glare that said, "You are fired before you even reach the kitchen." Bella's eyes flickered to Kendrick, and in them Harrison saw a flash of something he didn't expect, not fear, but contempt. It was the look of a superior, not a subordinate. She met Harrison's gaze again. The final term, she said, her voice dropping back into a whisper. "The probability function for the tunneling event, PQS. It's incorrectly defined. It doesn't account for relativistic effects on the electron shell at high energy states. It assumes a static electron density. It's not static." The room went completely silent. Mr. Davenport and Mr. Tanaka exchanged bewildered looks. They were fluent in profit margins and market caps, not quantum mechanics. Kendrick's face, which had been a mask of smug triumph, began to drain of color. He looked at Bella as if she were an apparition. That's absurd. Who are you to question my work?" "This is the most advanced research in the field." "It's stolen research." Bella said the words falling from her lips before she could stop them. The dam of her restraint had broken, and the person you stole it from realized the mistake 6 years ago. Under pressure, the catalyst won't just be inefficient, it will become unstable. The entire reaction will cascade. You're not building a green energy solution, Dr. Kendrick. You're building a bomb. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, and they all hit their mark. Harrison Sterling's eyes narrowed, shifting from Bella's resolute face to Kendrick's suddenly panicked one. Kendrick was sweating. A single bead rolled down his temple. He opened his mouth, but only a strangled noise came out. That single physiological sign of fear was more damning than any confession. Harrison slowly, deliberately capped his Mont Blanc pen. The click was like a gunshot in the silent alcove. He placed it neatly beside the unsigned contract. "Gentlemen," he said to his investors, his voice a chillingly calm sea after a storm. "It appears we need to pause for a moment to verify a technical query. My sincerest apologies for the interruption. Please enjoy a dessert on me. Robert." He snapped his gaze, locking onto his scientist. "Stay here." He stood up, his tall frame commanding absolute authority. He looked at Bella. "You. With me. Now." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and strode out of the alcove, expecting her to follow. Bella felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she placed the water pitcher on a nearby service stand, her hands moving with an automated grace she didn't feel. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Francois, was already power-walking towards her, his face a thundercloud. "Rossi, "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he hissed. Before she could answer, Harrison Sterling's voice cut across the dining room. He had stopped at the entrance, turning back. He didn't shout, but his voice carried an unmistakable weight that silenced the entire restaurant. "She's with me, Francois," he said, using the manager's name with a familiarity that was both a shock and a threat. "Add any damages to my bill." Francois froze mid-stride, his mouth agape. Bella straightened her apron, took a deep breath, and walked away from her table, away from her job, away from the life she had been hiding in. She walked past the gawking diners and the stunned staff, her head held high, and followed the billionaire out into the cool New York night, leaving $100 million deal and the ruins of her quiet life in her wake. The gilded cage was behind her, but she had no idea what lay ahead. The ride in Harrison Sterling's Maybach was a silent, tension-filled journey through the neon-streaked canyons of Manhattan. The car's interior was a cocoon of silent, opulent leather, a world away from the clatter of the restaurant kitchen. Bella sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap, the simple black fabric of her uniform seeming out of place against the plush cream upholstery. She could feel his eyes on her, analytical and piercing, as if he were trying to deconstruct her into her base components. He didn't speak until they were ascending in a private high-speed elevator in a sleek glass tower in the financial district. The building was home to the global headquarters of Sterling Dynamics. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice flat. "Isabella Rossi. And you're a waitress." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that he was trying to reconcile with the impossible event that had just occurred. For the past 5 years, yes. And before that. The elevator doors opened into a sprawling, minimalist office. It was more like an art gallery than a workspace with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of the city. A single massive desk made of polished obsidian stood in the center. Bella hesitated, the ghosts of her past swirling around her. "Before that, I was a doctoral candidate in computational chemistry at Caltech." Harrison stopped and turned to face her fully. A flicker of understanding crossed his features. "Caltech. Who was your advisor, Dr. Marcus Albright?" The name landed with a quiet thud. Harrison knew him. Albright was a star in the academic world, frequently collaborating with private industry. "I've read his work," Harrison said slowly, "including his 2019 paper on proton transfer catalysis, the one he co-authored with a postdoc, Robert Kendrick." Bella's silence was her confirmation. The air crackled with unspoken implications. That paper, Harrison continued, his voice dangerously soft, was the theoretical foundation for our entire green hydrogen project. It's what I invested $80 million of R&D into, and it was based on a flawed premise, Bella said, her voice finally finding its strength. A flaw I found and reported to Albright a week before he published. He stole my thesis, removed my name, and published it with Kendrick. Harrison stared at her, his mind racing, piecing together the ugly puzzle. The ambitious professor, the eager postdoc, the brilliant but naive graduate student. It was a story as old as academia itself. "Why didn't you fight it?" he asked, his tone less an accusation and more a genuine inquiry, with what Bella's laugh was brittle. "I was a 24-year-old student with $50,000 in debt. He was a tenured department head with the full backing of the university. Their lawyers would have buried me. So I did the only thing I could. I disappeared." He led her to a conference room adjacent to his office. With a tap on a glass wall, it frosted over, becoming opaque. He gestured for her to sit at the long, empty table. He remained standing, pacing like a cuttled panther. Tonight at that table, I was about to commit $100 million from my investors and leverage the future of my company on that formula, he said, thinking aloud. If you are right, you didn't just save me from a bad investment. You saved my entire company from catastrophic failure and public disgrace. If you are wrong, you're a lunatic who just cost me the biggest deal of my life for nothing. He stopped pacing and leaned on the table, his hands flat, his face close to hers. So, Isabella Rossi, former Caltech prodigy, I need to know. How certain are you? 100%, she said, without a moment's hesitation. The math doesn't lie. Dr. Kendrick's math is lying. Prove it. It was the ultimate challenge. For the next hour, Harrison Sterling grilled her. He wasn't just a businessman. His own background was in physics and engineering. He threw complex questions at her, citing obscure principles of quantum electrodynamics and materials science. He was testing her, pushing her, trying to find a crack in her knowledge. He found none. Bella, freed from the constraints of her waitress persona, came alive. The years of repressed knowledge and passion flooded back. She talked about spin-orbit coupling, about relativistic quantum chemistry, about the limitations of the Born-Oppenheimer approximation in their specific context. She filled a whiteboard with equations, her handwriting swift and confident. The tired waitress was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp scientist. Harrison watched his initial skepticism melting away into a dawning sense of awe, which quickly curdled into a cold, hard fury, directed squarely at his head of R&D. As Bella finished deriving the corrected version of the pull function, Harrison's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Davenport. Harrison, what the hell is going on? Kendrick just left the restaurant looking like he'd seen a ghost. Tanaka is ready to walk. Harrison typed a quick reply. Minor snag. Sit tight. I'll handle it. He looked up at Bella, a new expression on his face. It was one of calculated respect. All right, Ms. Rossi, he said, his tone shifting from interrogator to commander. You've convinced me there's a fire. Now I need you to help me find the arsonist. I'm giving you full access to our R&D servers. Everything. The raw data, the simulation logs, Kendrick's private project files. I want you to find me undeniable proof that he knew. I need the smoking gun. He paused, his gaze unwavering. My company is now in your hands. Can you do it? Bella looked at the complex equations on the whiteboard, her equations finally seeing the light of day. This was a chance not just for vindication, but for justice. A chance to reclaim the future that had been stolen from her. Yes, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she hadn't felt in 6 long years. I can. The Sterling Dynamics R&D lab was a stark contrast to the opulent executive suite. It was a cathedral of science, a sprawling, sterile white space, humming with the quiet power of supercomputers, and filled with the blue glow of holographic displays. For Bella, stepping inside was like taking her first breath after years of drowning. The scent of ionized air and clean room solvents was a perfume she had forgotten she loved. Harrison led her to a restricted access terminal in a glass-walled office. This was Kendrick's primary workstation. He explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. You'll have my personal override. Level 1 clearance. Nothing is hidden from you. He tapped his security card and pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner. With a soft chime, the system unlocked. The screen flickered to life, displaying complex molecular models and reams of data. My head of security, a man named Gavin, is a ghost in the system. He'll ensure Kendrick can't wipe anything remotely. But Kendrick is smart. If he's hiding something, it'll be buried deep, Harrison said. I have to go and placate my investors. I'm buying you time. Use it well. He left her alone. The silence of the lab settled around her, broken only by the whisper of the server fans. For a moment, the sheer scale of the task was paralyzing. She was sifting through a mountain of data equivalent to the entire Library of Congress, looking for a single deliberately hidden needle. But then the muscle memory of a researcher kicked in. She started not with Kendrick's conclusions, but with the raw, unprocessed sensor data from the experimental catalytic reactor. This was where the truth lived, before it could be manipulated or massaged to fit a desired outcome. The hours bled into one another. Bella forgot she was a waitress in a cheap, worn-out uniform. She was a scientist on the hunt. She compiled terabytes of data, her fingers flying across the holographic keyboard, her mind navigating complex data structures with an agility she thought she'd lost. She found the first discrepancy at 3:17 a.m. It was in the logs for a simulation run from 6 months prior. The official report signed by Kendrick showed a perfect, stable energy output. But Bella, digging into the machine-level logs, found the original unaltered data stream. For a nanosecond at peak pressure, the simulation had recorded an anomalous energy spike, a massive, uncontrolled release of gamma radiation. It was exactly what her corrected formula predicted. "Got you," she whispered to the empty room. The simulation hadn't crashed. A sophisticated subroutine had kicked in, isolating the anomaly and flagging it as a sensor error before continuing the test under modified parameters. The final report was a lie constructed from the falsified data. Someone had programmed the system to ignore reality. Bella dug deeper, looking for the origin of that subroutine. It was a masterful piece of code designed to be almost invisible. But its digital signature was unique. She cross-referenced it across the entire network. And then she found it again. And again. Dozens of simulations, all with the same hidden flaw, the same automatic data scrub. Kendrick hadn't made a mistake. He had systematically and deliberately concealed the instability of the catalyst for over a year. As dawn approached, casting a pale grey light over the city, Bella found the next piece of the puzzle. It was a folder hidden within the operating system's kernel files, a place no one would ever think to look. The folder was named M.A. Contingency. M.A. Marcus Albright, her former professor. Her blood ran cold. The folder was protected by a layer of powerful AES-256 encryption. It was a digital vault. Without the key, it was impenetrable. Bella's mind raced. What would the key be? A password? A phrase? Something personal to Kendrick and Albright. She thought back to her time in the lab, to the arrogant pronouncements of her professor. Albright had been obsessed with the greats of physics. He often quoted one in particular when talking about discovery. Raffiniert ist der Herrgott, aber boshaft ist nicht. Subtle is the Lord, but malicious he is not. Einstein's famous declaration of faith in a rational universe. Albright loved to say it. With trembling fingers, Bella typed the German phrase into the decryption prompt. She hit enter. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the screen flashed, decryption successful. The folder opened. It contained only 2 files. The first was a financial ledger. It detailed a series of untraceable cryptocurrency payments from a holding company in the Cayman Islands to an account linked to Dr. Robert Kendrick. The total came to $5 million. The name of the holding company was a simple, chilling anagram, Omnigen, Richard Hayes's company, Sterling's biggest rival. The second file was a short audio recording. Bella clicked on it. The voice that filled the silent office was unmistakable. It was Dr. Kendrick speaking to Richard Hayes. "The deal is set for tomorrow night," Kendrick's voice said, tinny and conspiratorial. "Sterling will sign. The investors will be locked in. Once they break ground on the first plant in Arizona, we give the data to our contact at the EPA. The anonymous tip. We show them the instability. Sterling Dynamics will be buried in lawsuits and regulatory hell. The stock will collapse. You'll be able to acquire their entire patent portfolio, including the real stable formula for pennies on the dollar." There was a pause, then Richard Hayes's smooth, predatory voice. "And the stable formula. You're sure you have it?" "Of course," Kendrick replied, and the next words hit Bella like a physical blow. Albright's little protégé figured it out years ago, just before he pushed her out. He's been sitting on it ever since. The corrected pool function. It's a work of art. The key was adjusting the sigma value for relativistic effects. A small change, but it makes all the difference. Bella sank back into the chair. Her breath knocked out of her. It was all there. The sabotage, the corporate espionage, the theft of her work not once but twice. Kendrick wasn't just hiding a flaw. He was planning to sell the cure to the highest bidder after the company he worked for was a smoking crater. She saved the audio file and the ledger to a secure external drive. She had her smoking gun. In fact, she had an entire arsenal. Just as she was about to call Harrison, an alert flashed in the corner of her screen. "Security warning, unauthorized Level 1 access detected. Sector 7G. Someone else was in the system with the same clearance level as her. She checked the access logs. The credentials weren't Harrison's. They were Kendrick's. But he was supposed to be locked out. Then she saw it. A remote deletion command was being executed, targeting the kernel directory where she'd found the encrypted folder. He was trying to cover his tracks. Gavin Harrison's security chief would stop him, but it would take a few seconds. In those seconds, the original files could be wiped forever. Bella didn't hesitate. She initiated a system-wide lockdown command, using Harrison's override to shut down all network access to the R&D servers. Her own terminal would be cut off as well, but it would be too late for Kendrick. A new warning flashed on her screen. This one more urgent. Physical breach alert, restricted lab. Level 3. Proximity sensor triggered. Someone was in the building. Someone was coming. And she was locked in the lab with the only existing copy of the evidence that could destroy them. The quiet hum of the servers was suddenly replaced by a much more menacing sound, the heavy metallic thump of a magnetic lock engaging. Bella was sealed inside the lab. The lockdown command had worked, but it had also turned her sanctuary into a trap. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. Kendrick wasn't just trying to delete files from home. He was here. He must have used a physical keycard or an old passcode that Gavin's digital sweep had missed. He was coming to destroy the evidence at its source. She looked around the sterile room. There were no weapons, no hiding places, just glass walls and glowing machines. The main door to the lab was a thick slab of reinforced steel. She watched the small security panel next to it. A red light blinked ominously. Access denied. System lockdown. She heard a muffled shout of frustration from the hallway, followed by a series of frantic beeps as Kendrick tried his keycard again and again. He was locked out. But for how long a man desperate enough to commit industrial sabotage on this scale wouldn't be stopped by a locked door? Bella's mind, trained to find solutions in complex systems, went into overdrive. She had the evidence on the thumb drive in her pocket. The original files were safe on the isolated server, but if Kendrick got to the terminal, he could physically destroy the machine. She needed to get out. She raced back to the workstation. The lockdown had severed her connection to the outside world. No phone, no internet. But she still had control of the lab's internal network. She pulled up the building schematics. The lab was part of a larger research wing, a labyrinth of clean rooms, server farms, and testing chambers. The lockdown had sealed the entire wing, but there might be another way out. Her eyes scanned the blueprints. A service corridor. A maintenance hatch designed for coolant pipe access. It was small, but it led into the building's ventilation system. It was a crazy movie plot idea, but it was the only one she had. From the hallway came a new sound, a high-pitched whirring noise. A drill. He was trying to bypass the electronic lock. She was running out of time. She located the maintenance hatch behind a large server rack. It was secured with 4 heavy bolts. Using a heavy metal stool as a wrench, she threw all her weight into turning them. Her muscles, accustomed to carrying trays and not turning industrial bolts, screamed in protest. One by one, with a groan of stressed metal, they gave way. She pulled the heavy panel open, revealing a dark, dusty shaft just big enough for a person to crawl through. Cool, recycled air washed over her face. She hesitated for a second, then hoisted herself inside, pulling the heavy panel closed behind her. Total darkness. The air was cold and smelled of dust and machine oil. She was in the guts of the skyscraper. Using the light from her phone, which had no signal but still worked as a flashlight, she began to crawl. The sounds of Kendrick's drill faded behind her, replaced by the deep, rhythmic hum of the building's life support. The schematics she had memorized were her only guide. Left at the first junction, then right past a massive air circulation fan that churned the air with terrifying force. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, but the drive in her pocket felt like a talisman pushing her forward. She was aiming for a vertical shaft that she hoped would lead down to the lower, non-secured floors. As she crawled, her mind kept replaying the audio file. Albright's little protégé figured it out years ago. The casual, dismissive cruelty of it fueled her resolve. This wasn't just about Harrison Sterling's company anymore. It was about reclaiming her own name. Suddenly, her phone screen went black. The battery was dead. The darkness was absolute. The humming of the fans seemed to grow louder, more menacing. Panic, cold and suffocating, began to close in. She was lost, blind, in a metal maze 60 stories above the ground. She fought it down, forcing herself to breathe slowly. She could still feel the flow of air. The schematics were burned into her brain. She kept crawling, navigating by touch and memory. After what felt like an eternity, her hand touched a different texture. A ladder. The vertical shaft. Relief washed over her so intensely her knees went weak. She began to climb down, her hands and knees scraped raw by the rough metal. She descended 2 floors before her foot hit a solid surface. Another access panel. She pushed. It swung open with a rusty creak, flooding her eyes with the dim artificial light of a deserted office floor. She tumbled out, covered in dust and grease, her waitress uniform torn and stained. The floor was empty, a sea of dark cubicles. It was a sales department, an entirely different section of the building. She had made it out of the lockdown zone. She ran for the emergency stairwell, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. She burst through the door and didn't stop running, taking the stairs 2 at a time, descending floor after floor. As she reached the ground-level lobby, she saw them. Harrison Sterling, flanked by 2 formidable-looking security guards, was arguing with the night shift staff. He looked frantic, his usual composure completely gone. "Miss Rosie Isabella!" He shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of raw panic and immense relief as he saw her emerge from the stairwell. She stumbled towards him, exhausted but triumphant, and held up the small black thumb drive. "I have it, Mr. Sterling," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "I have everything." Just as he took the drive from her hand, the lobby elevator chimed. The doors slid open. Standing inside was Dr. Robert Kendrick. His face was pale, his suit disheveled, and his hands were covered in grease. In one hand he clutched a portable drill. His eyes widened in shock as he saw Bella standing with Harrison. He looked from her to the drive in Harrison's hand and back to her face. In that single silent moment, he knew he was finished. His desperate gamble had failed. He made a sound, a choked, guttural cry of despair, and lunged. Not for Harrison or the drive, but for Bella. It was a purely instinctual, hateful act, an attempt to destroy the person who had brought his world crashing down. But he never reached her. Harrison's security guards moved with startling speed, intercepting him in a blur of motion. They tackled him to the marble floor with a sickening thud. The drill clattered away across the polished surface. The great Dr. Robert Kendrick, the man who had almost duped the world, was reduced to a writhing, defeated figure on the lobby floor of the company he had tried to destroy. Harrison ignored the commotion. He looked at Bella, at her torn clothes and the exhaustion etched on her face. He saw not a waitress, but a warrior. "Let's go finish this," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with the promise of a reckoning. The emergency board meeting was convened in the main conference room on the 60th floor, the very room Bella had been in just hours before. The sun was now fully up, casting long, dramatic shadows across the city. The mood, however, was dark and stormy. Mr. Davenport and Kenji Tanaka sat at the long obsidian table, their faces grim. They had been summoned by Harrison in the pre-dawn hours with a message that was both cryptic and alarming. They looked exhausted, confused, and deeply skeptical. $100 million deal didn't get paused by a waitress without serious consequences. Bella sat beside Harrison at the head of the table. She had been given a chance to clean up in a private washroom, but she had refused to change out of her torn and grimy waitress uniform. It was a statement. It was who she was when this began, and she would wear it as a badge of honor at the end. The door opened, and 2 of Harrison's security guards escorted a pale, haggard-looking Dr. Kendrick into the room. His wrists were in silver handcuffs. They sat him down at the far end of the table, opposite Harrison. The silence was heavy enough to bend steel. "Gentlemen." Harrison began, his voice cold and precise. "I apologize for the dramatics of the past few hours. When we last spoke, a serious allegation was made against the integrity of our project. I felt it was my duty to investigate it thoroughly before proceeding." He nodded towards Bella. "This is Isabella Rossi. She is the individual who brought this matter to my attention. She is also, as it turns out, the true architect of the foundational theory our entire project is based upon." Davenport and Tanaka stared at Bella, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and dawning curiosity. "That's preposterous," Kendrick spat from the end of the table, his voice cracking. "She's a nobody. A disgruntled, failed student trying to blackmail her way into a fortune." Harrison ignored him. He slid a tablet to the center of the table. "Robert, you're right about one thing. Ms. Rossi is a brilliant scientist. So brilliant, in fact, that she not only identified the flaw in your formula, she also found where you buried the evidence of your fraud." He tapped the tablet. A file directory appeared on the large screen at the end of the room. It showed the contents of the MA contingency folder. As you can see, Harrison continued, his voice dripping with ice. Dr. Kendrick was not merely incompetent. He was malicious. He knew the catalyst was unstable. He systematically programmed our simulation software to fake the results and hide the danger. He played the audio file. Kendrick's conspiratorial voice filled the conference room, laying out the entire plot to bankrupt Sterling Dynamics and sell the corrected formula to Omnigen. When Richard Hayes' voice came on, Kenji Tanaka let out a sharp, angry hiss. Omnigen had been a thorn in his own firm's side for years. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. Kendrick had shrunk in his chair, his face ashen. Mr. Davenport looked like he had been punched in the gut. "The $5 million in cryptocurrency has already been traced," Harrison said calmly. Half went to Kendrick. The other half went to his accomplice, Dr. Marcus Albright at Caltech, who provided him with the corrected formula, Miss Rossi's corrected formula, which they planned to sell after my company was in ruins. Kendrick finally broke. "He made me do it," he shrieked, pointing a trembling, cuffed hand towards the speaker, from which his own voice had come. "Hayes." He approached me. He knew about the flaw. Albright told him. They said Sterling was a fool and I was wasting my talent. They offered me everything." His voice trailed off into a pathetic sob. "Harrison." Sterling rose to his feet, his towering frame radiating a cold, righteous fury. "You didn't just try to defraud my investors and me," he said, his voice low and menacing as he walked toward Kendrick. "You were willing to build a facility that could have exploded. You were willing to let people die to cover your tracks and cash in. The only reason that isn't happening is because of her." He gestured to Bella. "Because a woman you and Albright dismissed and tried to erase had more integrity in her little finger than you have in your entire body. She was working for minimum wage, cleaning up after people like you. Yet she had the courage to speak up to prevent a catastrophe while you were counting your blood money." He stopped directly in front of Kendrick. "You're not just fired, Robert. I'm going to personally fund the federal investigation into you, into Albright, and into Richard Hayes. I will spend whatever it takes to ensure that you all spend the rest of your miserable lives in prison cells. Get him out of my sight." The guards hauled the weeping Kendrick to his feet and dragged him from the room. Harrison walked back to the head of the table. He looked at Davenport and Tanaka, whose expressions had transformed from skepticism to horrified respect. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone shifting back to business, "the Sterling Kendrick catalyst is dead. However," he looked at Bella, a genuine admiring smile touching his lips for the first time. "The Rossi catalyst is very much alive, Ms. Rossi has provided me with her corrected formula. It's not just stable. It's 20% more efficient than even Kendrick's faked data predicted. We are not back at square one. We are a light year ahead of where we thought we were." He picked up the contract portfolio that had been sitting on the table since the night before. With a decisive rip, he tore the signature page in half. He then turned to his laptop, typed for a moment, and a new document projected onto the screen. It was a new partnership agreement. "This is a new deal," Harrison announced. "Sterling Dynamics is forming a new subsidiary to oversee this technology. It will be called Rossi Sterling Innovations. Ms. Rossi will be appointed its Chief Technology Officer with a 25% equity stake and full creative control over the research. That is my non-negotiable term." "Are we still in business?" Mr. Davenport and Kenji Tanaka looked at each other. They looked at the new projections on the screen. Then they looked at Bella, the quiet waitress in a torn uniform, who now held the keys to the future of green energy. Davenport broke into a wide grin. "Mr. Sterling," he said, extending a hand, not to Harrison, but across the table to Bella. "It would be an honor to invest in Ms. Rossi's company." 6 months later, Isabella Rossi stood in a lab that made the one at Sterling Dynamics look like a high school chemistry classroom. The Rossi Sterling Innovation Center was a testament to what could be achieved when brilliance was given the resources it deserved. Sunlight streamed through vast 3-story windows, glinting off state-of-the-art equipment that Bella herself had hand-picked. She wore a crisp white lab coat over a simple but elegant dress. The black waitress uniform was a distant memory, a skin she had shed. Her team of 20 elite scientists, whom she had hired from the best universities in the world, worked diligently around her, their faces alight with the passion of discovery. The centerpiece of the lab was a gleaming pilot-scale catalytic reactor. Today was its first full-power activation. Harrison Sterling stood beside her, his usual bespoke suit replaced by a lab coat identical to hers. The investors Davenport and Tanaka watched from a safe glass-enclosed observation deck, their faces beaming. Ready CTO Rossi Harrison asked a playful but respectful tone in his voice. They had become partners in the truest sense of the word, their relationship built on a foundation of mutual admiration and a shared vision. "Ready, CEO Sterling," she replied with a confident smile. She initiated the startup sequence. On a massive monitor, data began to stream in. Pressure, temperature, energy input. And finally, the catalytic efficiency rating. The numbers climbed steadily, surpassing the old flawed projections, surpassing even her own corrected estimates. It settled at a number that made the whole room gasp. 78% efficiency. Harrison breathed his eyes wide. "Bella, that's impossible. The math doesn't lie," she said, softly echoing her own words from that fateful night. A round of applause erupted from the observation deck. Bella felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. It was more than just success. It was a restoration. Later that day, she sat in her spacious, sunlit office, the one that had replaced Harrison's imposing obsidian suite. A framed napkin hung on her wall, not the original from Aurelia, but a new one. On it, in her own handwriting, was the correct formula, the Rossi equation. The small subscript R for Rossi and the REL for the relativistic correction were a quiet testament to her victory. Her personal phone buzzed. It was a picture from her mother, who was on a cruise in the Mediterranean. Her medical bills paid off her health better than it had been in years. "Thinking of you, my brilliant daughter," the message read. There was a knock on her door. It was Harrison. "I have some news you might find interesting," he said, holding out a tablet. The headline was from a major financial journal. Omnigen CEO Richard Hayes indicted in corporate espionage scandal. Former Professor Albright and scientist Kendrick to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Justice. It wasn't just an abstract concept. It was real, and it was deeply satisfying. They deserved it, Bella said simply. They did. Harrison agreed. He looked around her office at the woman she had become, or rather the woman she had been all along. It's funny, he mused. I went to that dinner to sign a $100 million deal. I thought I was buying a formula. But it turns out I found something infinitely more valuable. And what's that? Bella asked, a curious smile playing on her lips. The person who wrote it, he said. I just had to look past the uniform to see her. Bella looked out the window at the city skyline, no longer a barrier of unattainable lights, but a landscape of possibility. Her past was not an anchor, but a foundation. She had walked through the fire of betrayal and emerged not burned, but forged. She was Isabella Rossi, and she was finally, truly home. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the fame. It was about integrity. Isabella Rossi's story reminds us that our circumstances don't define our worth. The world may see a waitress, a cashier, a janitor, but inside each of us can be a mind capable of changing the world. It's a powerful lesson in courage, the courage to speak truth to power, even when your voice is shaking. Harrison Sterling thought he had all the answers, but the most important truth came from the one person in the room everyone else had been trained to ignore. What hidden talents and forgotten dreams are lying dormant inside you, just waiting for the right moment to speak up? If this story inspired you or made you think, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. For more stories about the hidden heroes and incredible twists of fate that shape our world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.